Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here on a gorgeous day in a windowless room. After 2 weeks of wonderful presentations from our own PhD students, today we welcome Professor Susan Harkness to our International Social and Public Policy Seminar at the Social Policy Department here. Professor Harkness is Professor of Social Policy at the University of Bristol. Her research examines how gender and family structure shape income inequality and poverty. An economist by training, Professor Harkness uses quantitative methods to study less advantaged groups, including part-time and low-paid workers and single mother families. Her research has appeared in journals such as Demography, Social Forces, and Research in Social Stratification and Mobility. Prior to University of Bristol, Professor Harkness was the Associate Director for Policy at Understanding Society. She has also worked at universities of Bath, Sussex, and at the LIC. Her current research is funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and it examines the family change and its implications for social policy. And today, she will be presenting on the increasingly complex family structures in the UK and its implication for welfare provision. So without further ado, let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to speak today. Stand in front of it so you can see the slides. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about family change and social welfare, family change and social welfare primarily, but I'm also going to touch a little bit on child maintenance provision. And I've sort of typed this originally, whose income counts in complex families, because that's really what I want to think about, is who is responsible for providing for children in an increasingly complex world where children's family responsibilities towards children are not always terribly clear. Okay, so just in terms of a little bit of background, I should say this is not a particularly quantitative piece of work, so I'm going to present some data, but it's very descriptive, and this is kind of early days. It's part of a project that's been funded relatively recently in 2024 by the Nuffield Foundation, and we're going to be thinking about family change, welfare, and the child maintenance policy. Okay. So within this broader project, we've kind of got 4 main aims. It's first of all to think about what's happening to families, and I'll tell you why that's important in a moment. So how is family changing? And then we're going to be thinking about analysing the link between family structure, income, spending, and other aspects of child well-being, looking at international policy differences, and then modelling some alternative, the financial implications of if we thought about the family differently, what would that look like? So that's the kind of what we will be doing over the course of the whole project. So today I'm just going to focus really on sort of 2 key parts of that. Before I do, let me just tell you what, give you some definitions. These are the family types essentially I'm going to be thinking about. So first of all, biological parents. And when I think about biological parents, when I talk about biological parents, I'm not particularly about, I'm going to use the term biology to also refer to biological and adoptive parents. So it's really thinking about the nature of the relationship, which I'm going to term biological, and the responsibilities that implies for children. Okay. So where I say biological, it also means, and also including adoptive, but it's implicit in biological parents. Second is step parents. So this is the parent who I'm just going to describe as an adult who's co-resident with a partner of a child's biological parent, biological or adopted, and just the important point to note here is that when I think about step parenthood, I'm just thinking about co-residence. So I know in the sort of legal definition requires marriage for you to be a step parent, but if we look at ONS definitions of step parenthood, it's a much broader definition, and I'm going to stick with the broad definition of step parenthood and just think about residential arrangements. Okay, step families are going to be couples where we have couples living in the same household and where one parent is not the biological parent of at least one child, or adopted, and then we have blended family. So this is the other family type that is increasingly seems to be increasingly common, which is a family type where both members of the couple have a child in common, or biological parents, and then there's another child in the household who is a stepchild. Okay. I should say, and this is a limitation, families are complex, they're really complex and increasing, well, I think they're increasingly complex, although we're going to focus on just post-2010, not the sort of changing of the time because of data limitations. But just to say, I'm focusing only on children under the age of 18, and that means we're going to miss out on some other forms of complexity, because we also know that, for example, if you have a new family, so you have a new partner and you have another child, you're likely to have sort of a longer birth space between those children, which means that we're probably not going to capture those children who have siblings who have left home. So I'm not going to be able to do that because, well, first of all, I'm restricting to the month to under 18, but that's partly on the basis that I think many of those children, those other children that are older, are unlikely to be captured in the data. So that's the restriction I've made. And we could, we probably in the future will explore whether sort of loosening that restriction can help if we can track those older stepchildren. Okay, so just in terms of today's aims, I want to two things I want to do. I want to understand how families are changing in the UK, and I want to see how that interacts with the benefit system, just the benefit and child maintenance system, and then also to think a little bit about what lessons we might learn from other countries' treatment of these increasingly complex families in the welfare and child maintenance. Okay, and just to sort of step back a bit then in terms of motivation, one of the things that has motivated me to think about this is partly this idea that single parenthood, around 1 in 4 children live in single parent families, that hasn't changed over time, and therefore there's this, I think, almost complacent idea that we don't need to do anything. We've got the tax credit system, we've got universal credit, we don't need to think very much about single parents anymore. But I think, and we can't show this today because we haven't got the data, but it seems to me that fairly obvious that we know families break down more often. And so whilst it's sort of 20 to 25% of children may live in single parent families, we know by the time children are adults, around 44 or 45% parents will have separated. Okay, and again, that share depends a little bit on the data source you look at. So it seems to me fairly obvious that even if you have a stable rate of single parenthood, that could easily disguise other changes in family lives. So single parenthood is not static. Parents separate, but then they repartner, so they're no longer single parents, and they have their children, and this leads to kind of complexity in families' lives. And if we look across European nations, so the Gender and Generation Survey, which has been analysed quite widely in other European countries, really tells us family complexity is growing, and we know that's the case. So the work in particular in Thomson and Anderson really shows these family changes. Now we have new Gender and Generation Survey data from the UK, so that's something to look at as well. So we can look at more of the sort of history of family lives. Okay, so families are complex, and I'm going to show you what family complexity looks like in the UK. And we think complexity is growing, the data isn't that great on it. But just as these families are becoming more complex, or appear to be becoming more complex, we also know that welfare provision is becoming much more determined by sort of traditional notions of the family. And so we have these kind of, on the one hand, very complex families, on the other, welfare increasingly being rolled out, and welfare being provided to families on the basis that they're sort of a traditional family unit. Okay, and we know this to be true. So Nicholas Timmins has, as part of data review, has shown that there's this growing reliance on means testing, particularly tax credits or universal credit today, and those have been extended and rolled out to many relatively low-income families who are typically in work. So that has led to a sort of really vast increase in means testing. And the estimates, the estimates of who's affected by means testing, Tom Waters and Wernham at the IFS suggest that once universal credit is fully rolled out, then 30% of couples with children and 84% of single parents will be entitled to universal credit. So that's the sort of current estimates. And I should say that is actually, not that long ago was the case that the IFS were estimating that there were more single parents in receipt of means tested benefits than they could find single parents. So it's almost universal if you're a single parent to receive some form of means tested support. But a lot of couples are also in receipt of benefits, 30% in the latest data. In addition, we've got child benefit, again, subject to this high income benefit charge. And that because the threshold for high income, it has not been keeping up with changes in earnings or inflation. We know that more and more families are being dragged into effectively means testing on one income in order to receive child benefit. So that affects 1 in 5 families, estimated to affect 1 in 5 families. Okay, so we've got these kind of two contrasting trends. On the one hand, we've got families getting complex. On the other hand, we've got the welfare system really depending much more on a family unit in order to assess what their entitlement should be. And that's really what's kind of motivating me to think about family change. Okay, now, when we think about means testing, so we've seen this extension of means testing, we know in the welfare system, means testing really requires a really strong set of assumptions about individuals' obligations to one another. Okay, and of course, if you think about what happens in the benefit system, the minute a partner moves in with you, if you're claiming benefits, you are effectively deemed a couple. Okay, so there's some, we can think about what a couple means, but essentially that is the picture, is you have a new partner, you lose entitlements to any benefits that were previously means tested. And of course, that could affect low-income single parents, but also slightly higher-income single parents who, for example, might be receiving child benefit. So it's kind of really important how we think about what this couple is, because the assumption is that within a family, everyone shares resources and we have the same standard of living. Now, the other thing that we know is that the welfare system not only assumes that this step parent that comes in will provide for that family unit, but we also know it ignores that when we assess welfare, it ignores maintenance payments that come in. So the payments from the biological parent are ignored when we think about welfare provision. And of course, there might be good reasons for that. We want to encourage non-resident fathers typically to support their children. But I think the contrast is interesting, particularly when we set it up against the legal system, because in the legal system, step parents have absolutely no obligations towards the stepchildren. They have no requirement to provide, yet they're assumed to provide in the welfare system. But biological parents, whose income isn't recognised in the welfare system, are required to provide, even though we know often that provision doesn't happen. So these are the kind of contrasting assumptions we have. So we can kind of think about drawn a little, see my children have drawn a little table, a little figure, and what you can see is this sort of the contrast between the legal obligations. So if you think about a household and you think about legal requirements, we have a couple, they have a shared child they're jointly responsible for. There might be a previous child from another relationship, somebody outside the household would be responsible for them alongside the parent within the household. And of course, many of these adults in the household, the new partners, have children elsewhere. And I think the share is really quite large. So many of these step parents are paying out of the household as well. And of course, this looks very different to what is welfare assumes, which is basically everybody in the household shares, and we just totally ignore these people outside. So I think the sort of setup, the contrast between the legal obligations and the welfare obligations, the assumed welfare obligations, look really very different. Okay, so this is kind of what we're thinking about at the moment. And this just essentially sums up some of these obligations within the maintenance system and the welfare system. I suppose one other thing perhaps to note is when we think about legal obligations and child maintenance, support, is that if we think about non-resident parents, clearly have an obligation to pay to support the child. The other thing just to note is that shared care in the UK, even where care is fully shared, there is a maintenance obligation. And I think that's also quite important to note because it really relies on this assumption of a provider and a carer, and that has implications for, well, how we think about parental roles, whether they're inside the household or outside the household. So I would argue, and it's a slightly separate point, but in terms of child maintenance, the model is really quite out of date. Okay. Very different to what happened in Sweden, for example. I'm not going to talk more about that now. The other thing to note is that when there are other children in the household, the maintenance obligations do reduce slightly, when a non-resident parent has other children that they live with, and it reduces the income on which they're assessed by 11%. So there is some recognition of other children for non-resident parents. In terms of welfare obligations, it's worth noting, well, two key things really. In terms of welfare, if you are a receiving parent, then you effectively that income is discounted in your calculation for benefits, so that's ignored completely. But on the other hand, if you're paying parent, so you're paying out of the household, that income is not accounted for in either tax credit or tax credit calculations or calculations for other benefits. So there is some anomalies, I think, here.
Sorry, when you say it's not accounted for, you mean it's not deducted from your income, or it isn't included in your income?
So if you're paying
into another,
there's no account for the maintenance you pay. So there's no recognition of your obligation. The household you've got to family members who don't live in your house. So even though you're legally obligated, welfare system doesn't recognise that at all. Although there's some small recognition that you have in the maintenance system, but not the welfare system, then you have children in the house, in other children in the house. Okay, so it's quite complicated, but okay, if there's any clarifications, do ask. I haven't explained it very well. Okay. Anyway, I think the key point is that this is all quite messy in terms of thinking about who is obligated to who. Okay, now what do we know? So this is kind of the assumed obligations in the welfare system and in the child support system. What actually happens in practice? Well, if we think about parents without care, so the non-resident parents, and the language has got a little bit sort of tricky about this, because I think we're not, the DWP refers to them as parents without care. Previously, non-resident parents was the term, so I might slip between them. But what we essentially know is that child maintenance receipt, well, it's certainly not universally received by children whose parents don't live with them. So we know, well, the evidence of Kakavitra and Jokela in 2019 suggests that around a third of children with separated parents regularly receive child maintenance. And I think the latest child maintenance statistics show that there are a large share of families where maintenance is not paid. Average payments are also typically low, and we know that repartnering is also a risk factor for those maintenance payments stopping. So we frequently see a decline in maintenance paid in to support a child when either partner repartners. So a new partner of the non-resident parent or if the resident parent tends to report the maintenance. Okay. The other thing to note is that shared care is increasingly important. So the maintenance assumption is based on this a carer financial provider role essentially. Yet we know that 5% of children overall report aged 10 to 15 have a second home, and we also know that many children, about 1/3 of children in separated families, report living staying with a non-resident parent. And these, of course, this is another aspect of step parenting we can't really capture in our data because, of course, in that other home, we may also have other step parents. There may be two sets of step parents, of course. We can't capture that in our data. We can only capture it in the household where the data is collected. So there's some data collected specifically on child maintenance in these relationships, but we don't have any data on the second homes. Okay. Just very briefly, just to note on child maintenance, because I think it's quite interesting. As we've just said, child maintenance, so it's assumed that non-resident fathers provide, but we also know that the share that do provide is relatively low, and where payments are made, they're relatively low. And we can also look across countries, and if this dark, in each of these countries, we have these 12 countries, in each of these countries, this is earnings that comes into the household. And then the second wedge around is maintenance payments. And we can see that in no country do maintenance payments really make up very much of income amongst, well, these are just single mother families, but I think it's indicative of this kind of picture we see. Maintenance, it's discussed a lot in policy, but in terms of income packages, it's really enormously outweighed. So the UK is covered by the sharing button, but it's really outweighed in terms of its importance by other types of social assistance or transfers. So maintenance, it's kind of discussed a lot in terms of policy at the moment in particular, but it's far less significant than other types of income, and particular benefit income or earnings. Now, what about, so this is the sort of assumption of the non-resident parents. What about step families? Well, the work on step families basically tells us that step families are regarded as terms an incomplete institution. And the idea here is that there's a lack of institutional framework and social norms that govern relationships in step families. So I think this is obviously it's evidence particularly focused on remarriage from the 70s, but obviously very relevant today, and probably even more relevant to cohabiting families, which seem to be the most common family type. And we also know from other studies of the US and internationally that there are very widely differing expectations about what step-parents should do. So should they provide? And in fact, very many people don't really believe it's a role of a step-parent, certainly prior to marriage, to provide. Yet the welfare system assumes that. Okay. And I think this was sort of exhibited to me on radio one morning. I was listening to Elizabeth Day speaking, and as she says, I'm not the one doing the parenting. So I think this sort of really captures the very different type of relationship step-parents have with their children, with their stepchildren. So the ideas of sort of who's responsible for those stepchildren, I think, come out quite strongly in this quote. Okay. So I thought it was a nice quote. Okay. What do we know about step-parents in practice? So, of course, anecdotally, we can see that step-parents have a different type of relationship with their stepchildren. What about the actual evidence? Well, in practice, we can see in step-parent families, there's evidence that they're less likely to pool their income, so they're less likely to share their income, I suppose. So when we think about having joint bank accounts and so on, we see more individualization within these families. Okay. We also know, and some of this relates to adult stepchildren, some of this evidence relates to independent children, but the evidence essentially tells us that children may benefit less from a step-parent's income than biological children. And I think the best known study of that is probably the study of Anne Case, Sarah Flanagan, and somebody else whose name I've forgotten. But there's also more recent studies looking at similar types of questions. And these suggest that stepchildren benefit less than biological children from a parent's income. And then there's a lot of work on repartnering, and it includes some books on the work I've done with Paul Gregg and Marina Salgado, and that essentially shows, as alongside many other studies, that when people repartner, when you repartner, the outcomes of children don't really improve. So although income goes up, it doesn't really lead to an improvement in child outcomes. And in fact, these sort of outcomes are very similar for those growing up in step families as those growing up in parent. So the evidence is that whilst income goes up, it doesn't really seem to do that much to improve children's outcomes. So the measures we looked at were educational outcomes, but of course, I think the evidence probably would give you a similar picture. In fact, for emotional outcomes, the mechanisms would be quite different, but you get a similar picture across different types of outcomes. Okay. Now, so I think what this leads to is a question about whether there's a gap in provision. So if biological parents meant to provide but don't, and step parents are not required to provide but are assumed to in the welfare system, then what happens when in step families? And so I suppose one of the things we wanted to think about is, well, is there a gap in provision? We can think about this in several ways, but one of the things we can think about is what happens to single parents who repartner, and that's something this we specifically wanted to do. So if a single parent repartners, what happens to their income? And what we know in the UK system is that as soon as you repartner, form a couple, you need to declare that you're living together. Okay, so if you claim that you're living together, however, given the very high share of single parents who receive benefits through the welfare system, we might expect individual incomes to decline because their benefit entitlements fall. And if we go back to the previous sort of circle diagrams, we can see that in the UK, benefits for single parents are an enormously important part of the income package. So we might expect to see quite a radical change there. So repartnering may mean that even if household income goes up, and this is what we'll look at in a moment, we might see a decline in individual incomes. And if income isn't shared, that's going to have very potentially important consequence for children's well-being. And the other thing perhaps to note in the UK context is that when you don't declare you're living with a partner, well, then you're committing living together fraud and error. And this is one of the, in fact, it's the third most common reason for benefit fraud. So, you know, it's quite problematic. Either you lose your benefits or you're committing fraud and error. And that's, again, it's considered a major part of fraud in the benefit system. Okay. The other thing to just note is that when these new partners come in, of course, they may be providing for other children, and we know that in the UK HLS data, around 40% of these new partners are paying income to children elsewhere, or have children elsewhere, so should be paying income to those other children, and that, of course, is likely to influence how well able they are to support step families as well, even if they do share. Okay, so just on to a bit of data then. So I think I'm going to think a bit about what family structure looks like in the UK, and then I'm going to think about income packages, and then I'm going to think about some policy models. So that's the structure of the rest of the talk. Okay. So again, this is just that data, understanding society data collected from 2009 to 2021-22. Of course, we did have British Household Panel Survey data from before, but it's significantly smaller sample sizes, so we haven't used that. And the advantage of the understanding society data is that it's got, well, it has a relationship grid, and you can identify relationships between all household members. And I think, well, one thing that's quite clear, you know, if you look at different data sources, is that there aren't very many robust studies of step parenthood in particular, so they're quite hard to identify. So you can do this in Understanding Society. It is a survey, there is attrition, and sort of representativeness is a potential issue, but I think so we will be trying to triangulate against other data sources. But it's worth noting that other data sources, including the census, really undercount step families because they don't have a full relationship grid. They rely on the first 5 people, so they miss out. They miss out people. So it's quite problematic, I think, in some of the data sources, and particularly if you go back over time, often these step parent relationships are not picked up. So I think this is sort of a recognised problem. The Children's Commissioner, I think, has said multiple times that we don't really know how many of these types of families there are. So that's the first sort of caveat, but I think the Understanding Society data, again, with some caveats that there's attrition and so on, is a reasonably good source. Okay. Right, so as before, I'm going to think about biological parents, where they're biological parents, and I'm just going to assume that children, biological parents, they're biologically related to the children, biological families is going to assume that all of the children in the household are the biological children of the parents, and that there are no step or half siblings. Okay. So we don't necessarily all the children have a biological relationship to both parents. So step-parent families, on the other hand, are step-parent or there may be step-parent or step-sibling relationships. So what this means is a step-family might also be a lone parent family, could be a step-family if there are step-siblings. And then within step-parent families, I'm going to split the couples in particular into step-parent families where there are no common children and into blended families. So I realise that perhaps the sort of terminology isn't quite right. So if anybody has any thoughts on whether they should be called step-parent families or there's some other terminology that's better, I would love to hear it. Okay, so this is just the first picture, which just goes by age. I'm afraid this didn't look quite like this on my screen. But what we can see here is that as children get older, unsurprisingly, the share of children living with both biological parents declines, and there's the total at the end. So the top of the bar represents those at a child level, those living with both biological parents, so it's just over 80%, 82.3%, and it declines to just over 60% in the state by age 17. Okay. Now the white bit of that bar just shows you how many they may be living with their own biological parents, but they've also got a step sibling in the house. So this also accounts for children who live with both parents, but where there is a step sibling present. So we can see that even when children live with both parents, there's still complexity. Okay. The second slide, sorry, I don't know what happened here. I should have put it in a PDF. This second one just shows what's happened to lone parenthood. So the lone parents share, again, unsurprisingly, goes up over time. So you're more likely to live in a lone parent family as you get older. So repartnering doesn't do everything to reduce lone parenthood. The white bar that was here showed the share with half siblings, and then I've also lost somewhere the shares. So there's a small share of lone parents with step siblings. It's not insignificant, it's a few percentages. And then we've got step-parent families with no step or half siblings. And then I had on the top here, and it's vanished, apologies, blended families. But the share of blended families is fairly similar to the share of step-parent families. In fact, it's slightly higher, just so I'm sorry you can't see it. It doesn't show up on this slide. But that's essentially what we see. So we see an increase in lone parenthood, but we also see a fairly large increase in other family forms, so particularly step-parent families and blended families. Okay, now what do the income packages of these families look like? So, I mean, if our concern is whether the children are getting the support they need, then it's kind of useful to know where they sit in the income distribution and where their income comes from. So this just really describes where those children are in the benefit system. I think you can look at an earlier period or a later period, it doesn't matter enormously, but I think the key things to note here are that, unsurprisingly, single parent families rely heavily on out-of-work benefits, means-tested in-work benefits, and most of them receive, well, also they receive likely to receive child benefit. So only 4% of single parents are fully out of means testing, in that they don't receive any means-tested benefit, and they don't receive child benefit. Okay, and the numbers actually have gone up to 8% by 2018-19 to 21-22, and this, of course, just reflects that the child benefit cap is kind of increasingly moving up the distribution. Yeah.
I have a clarification question.
Sure.
Are these cross-sectional longitudinal? So are these the same families between 2010 to 2014, or is this a cross-section?
It's just a cross-section. Yeah, it's a cross-section, and it's merged as well. Yeah. Okay. So these are our single-parent families. So relatively low income, much more likely to be assessed in means tested. Then if we compare them, so we've got our sort of traditional families over here. So a reasonable chunk receive means-tested support, particular tax credits. But if we compare them with, well, actually blended families in particular, we can see that actually, although they're less likely to be on out-of-work benefits, they're also very, very likely to be within means-tested. Step-parent families look a little bit different, so they don't have common children. They're less likely to be affected by means testing. But blended families who are as common as step-parent families in our data, and I'm sorry you couldn't see it, look very, well, they don't quite look like single parents because one adult is likely to be working, but they're very much affected by means testing. The other thing just to note here is that they're also, and I think this is sort of in line with our expectations, but they're less likely to be receiving benefit, maintenance, child maintenance. So again, the evidence, although this is just descriptive, the difference is kind of as we expect. So child maintenance is less likely to be received. Okay, we can also look at the income composition of these families, but what I just want to focus on is what happens when single parents then repartner. So if we think a little bit about what happens to family income, so you're a single parent, you have a reasonable, maybe half your income up from the earnings, half from benefit income in some form. What happens to the household income package when you repartner? And what we can see is that, well, in the blended families in particular, we see that the household earnings do go up, but her earnings fall slightly. So there is a decline in her earnings. We can see that the benefits, well, household benefits change. So we get well, in blended families in particular, there's no significant change in benefit income. But what we can also see is there's a redistribution between his and her benefits. So the Understanding Society is nice data in that it lines up to split these benefits. And what we can see is that her income entitlement is really changing when she restructures. We can see these pictures in terms of individual income. And I think what we'd like to do is kind of back this out over the full time series. Okay, so what happens to family income? Well, it goes up a little bit. Net income goes up. Equivalized income goes up, but her income is going down, and that's the key thing. Just to,
yeah. No, I just want to know how do you split? So how does Understanding Society split the benefit? Because some of the benefit, aren't like some of the benefits are going to universal credit goes to a joint account, right?
Yeah, so some of them are evenly shared. So it's sort of.
So do we know? Is that partly? Are they then going to be evenly shared? So we don't, is some of that evenly split now?
Exactly. Some of it's evenly split. I'd have to look at the data because I've actually forgotten exactly how we do it. There are some things that you can think are going to be very evenly split. So things like housing. So one thing we've done is take housing costs out. And actually it doesn't change very much. So I think that's a little bit surprising. But I can't remember the detail. Christine, it's a really good question.
Because it might not necessarily be that it may be that now that it's joint access, right? It's not that she necessarily has less access to less money, but it's in a shared account where it was in hers. Is that fair?
I think, well, it's not in terms of step-parent families, and I think because with step families, the benefits definitely go down. I think in terms of, I would need to check exactly where the benefits change, but yeah, we could effectively split them, and I can't exactly remember which ones change, but I will check that. But what you can essentially see is this rebalancing of the household income, and we can also put in housing, and that doesn't change very much. But you're absolutely right, I should figure out where those are. And I probably thought about it at one point, but it's not housing is the one thing that housing can't do it. Okay, now I just want to say a little bit about sort of some international comparisons in terms of policy treatment. So I'll do this relatively briefly because I think one of the things that comes out by thinking about structure. So if you think about maintenance structures and sort of assumed responsibilities of parents, and if you think about the welfare system and assumed responsibilities of household members, it suggests that maybe our welfare system isn't terribly optimally designed. So how could we do it better? And well, obviously we can start with Sweden. And I suppose the first thing to note here is that, well, where you have a system, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting, even in the Swedish context. So if we think about Sweden, child benefits are provided for children. They're not means tested, and therefore another person's income in the household obviously doesn't affect your entitlements. Interestingly, when biological parents have joint custody, the benefits may be split between them, but it's not possible for any benefits to go to step parents. So we still have this kind of biological determinism in terms of who gets the income. The step-parents have no entitlements unless they're guardians, but they can't be guardians unless the non-resident parent gives up their guardianship. That's really rare. However, we don't have this problem of means testing, and therefore the system of support seems to be, much less affected, I think, and much more clearly aligned with the parents' obligations towards their children. Okay, adult benefits I won't talk about, not really relevant here. So this is kind of a nice, straightforward system, but biology determines your entitlement, biology or adoption, not step-parenthood. Now, means testing seems to be the particular problem for these types of welfare support. So where means testing is the norm, I would say in the UK in particular, the focus has tended to be on defining couples. So there's these debates about when do you become a couple, and there are various indicators of when you're a couple. So this is a debate that's taking place in the UK. There was a report on Living Together, Fraud and Error, which talked a lot about how we define a couple. And similar debates I think have taken place in Australia when they think about these welfare entitlements. And you can kind of think, well, this could be determined by couple status. Couples sometimes register as couples, so they register the couple status, or you might assess whether they're a couple based on financial. So these are some of the discussions that have taken place in the past. Now, for example, in Australia. So in Australia, we've got this kind of quite complex model of welfare support, where entitlements to child-related benefits are dependent on family income. So any children in the household, regardless of their relationship to other household members, are treated as the same in the same unit of assessment. Now they have quite a complex model because some differences between the UK. Perhaps this table summarises it. We have these different types of tax benefits. One difference is that maintenance payments are deducted from these entitlements, and maintenance payments matter. And if you don't have a maintenance agreement in place, it may reduce your eligibility for benefits. But otherwise, it's a sort of, I think, fairly similar. It's different or similar because the way we think about couples varies a bit. You have an individual, partial individualization. You have an individual entitlement until your partner earns too much, and then your individual entitlement disappears, and maintenance is treated differently. But the key thing to note about the Australian system, even though it's sort of more favourably moving towards individualisation, is that it doesn't. These living together indicators don't really tell us about the source children. So in many ways, we could think these are quite. This debate is the wrong debate, even though it is a debate that has been had. So are these really a good indicator? Is living together a good indicator of commitments to children? And I would suggest they're probably not really. It's not really the right debate to be had. Instead, I think policy needs to concentrate on relationships between children and adults. And that's something that I don't think we've heard an awful lot about in the UK context. Okay. Now, where does that? Well, although I don't think we would use the welfare state as a sort of brilliant example here for many things, in terms of its structures, I think it offers a little bit more advanced. And let me give you another quote that I quite like, which is from a paper Marianne Mason written in 2008, and she quotes the Wisconsin court. And she says, and we might think this is very backward in many ways, but she says, a good Samaritan should not be bad-saddled with the legal obligations of another, and we think the law should not with alacrity conclude that a step-parent assumes parental responsibility to a child. And this kind of framework, as problematic as it is certainly today, where we've moved away from these kind of carer and dependency relationships for women, it really does kind of inform how they think about, well, how the welfare system has historically being thought of. And of course, given all the caveats that it's very ungenerous and so on. So of course we've got different forms of welfare in the US. So we've got TANF or AFDC payments, so the sort of traditional welfare payments. And I think one of the things that really comes out from the articles of Robert Moffat and colleagues is that the rules governing payments to low-income families vary, although they vary by state. They are primarily, at least historically, based on biological relationships. and not on marital status or cohabitation. And again, in the literature, I think this is kind of, we often assume that marriage and cohabitation are the same, and we assume children are children, and we don't really think about what the relationship is between adults and children. But the welfare system does, and I think that's often surprised people who do evaluations and so on, because we rarely think about it. So I think this is the first kind of key point to note. And as Moffat and Whelan and the co-authors note, over half of US states treat step-parents as being outside the assessment unit. So if we think about equivalent to the UK, the benefit unit or the family, they take that income of the step-parents out. Except when they have a joint child, so blended families are different. And I should say this is it's sort of quite a generalisation because there is state variation. So, but this is broadly where the sort of policy in the US has evolved from. There's variation, but this is the kind of way in which it has been thought of. Now, we also have the earned income tax credit, so obviously some similarities to the UK model, but also some significant differences. Key things to note here is that income assessment, when couples are married, they're just treated as the couples who are assumed to share and make that decision to share resources. But cohabiting couples, that is not the case, and children can be broken out of that unit of assessment and attached to one parent's income. So much more of an individualised approach, and children being attached to individual parents. So that kind of protects the income entitlements of parents who have cared for their children. And then the other thing that's kind of really interesting in the US is actually the treatment of these non-residents, so these parents in other households, these non-resident parents. And what we see in two examples are New York and Washington, DC, where they have this non-custodial parent, EITC, and what that essentially does is, unlike most systems, it recognises the cost of paying out, and in the welfare system, I don't mean just in the maintenance system, in the welfare system, and that allows parents to non-custodial parents, if they've paid child support and are up to date with the payments, then they can claim some recognition in the welfare system for those obligations in other households. And I think this sort of extension of the welfare entitlements beyond a single kind of residence is kind of a really interesting model, and kind of it's quite reflective of certainly family changes we've seen today. Okay. So a bit more detail there. So just in summary, actually I won't summarise because I haven't got enough time. We can also think about how this interacts with the maintenance system, and again, the UK is on the one hand very favourable to parents with care who are allowed to keep maintenance. It's not included in universal credit. That's quite unusual. So of course, in many other countries, the sort of obligation of parents to provide for their children has kind of been coupled with the idea of reducing spending through the welfare system. That's not the case in the UK. So frequently, as in Australia and in the US, benefits entitlements reduce when you receive maintenance. On the other hand, in terms of the receiving parents, there's no deductions. It's very unfavourably treated in the UK. And in comparison, I think particularly Australia, we see that maintenance can be deducted, so much more favourable treatment of those that don't live with their children. Okay. And of course, we could talk a lot more about child maintenance. There's a whole other host of really interesting kind of decisions about how we think about obligations. So I'm just going to conclude. And of course, key messages: children's families are complex. The current system doesn't reflect family life. And there needs to be, I think there needs to be an alignment between the welfare system and the legal system to reflect these differences in obligations. If we think about step-parent families, I think we need to think about the relationship not between adults but between children, and how people within the households are required or not required to provide for children. And if we think about the role of separated parents, we need to think about multi-family households and how we might, rather than kind of assuming a purely provide a role for the non-resident parent, we might want to think about how we would provide a more supportive way of ensuring that they're able to both care and provide. So of course provision is important, but so being able to provide is also important. So we need to recognise that provision, and we also need to think about the role of care. So when parents separate, for example, in the UK, even when you share care, the fact that you still have to pay maintenance at a 50% rate is possibly very out of line with the new sort of world where women may earn as much as their partner, but are also more likely to receive care. So in many ways, all the systems don't really protect family life. In terms of future research, I think we're going to be extending our analysis to think of the mechanism driving these sort of changes in income packages. So what is it about repartnering that changes the income packages, and how do we condition on some of the sort of factors around the selection of particular types of people into repartnering, for example. We're going to be thinking about assessing the consequences of these changes in income packages in particular for children, and then we're going to be looking more at child maintenance policy. That's what we plan to do in the future. Okay, thank you.